In November of 1956, British paratroopers held the northern approaches to the Suez Canal within a matter of days. On paper, the operation had gone almost exactly to plan. Port Said had fallen. Egyptian resistance had been broken by naval bombardment and airborne assault. And yet 3,000 miles away, inside the vaults of the Bank of England, a different battle was being lost far faster than the one being fought on the ground. Sterling was being sold, not in the ordinary volumes of a trading day, but in a sustained and deliberate wave that was draining Britain's gold and dollar reserves at a pace the Treasury had never recorded outside of a world war. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, watched the weekly reserve figures arrive like a man watching his own pulse weaken. In the first days after the invasion alone, Britain lost close to $100 million from a reserve base that could not absorb losses of that size for long. The generals had accomplished their mission, the bankers had not, and somewhere in Washington a decision was taking shape, quietly, without press conferences or declarations of anything, that would decide whether the pound sterling survived the month. This is the story of a canal seized in days, and an empire's finances surrendered in a weekend, and of a phone call that historians still argue over almost 70 years later, because nobody can fully agree on whether it happened exactly the way the men who lived through it remembered it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why a currency crisis could unmake a military victory, you have to go back 81 years to a transaction that had nothing to do with tanks or treaties. In 1875, the Ottoman-appointed ruler of Egypt, Khedive Ismail Pasha, stood at the edge of bankruptcy. His government owed enormous sums to European creditors, and among his few remaining assets was Egypt's 44% stake in the Suez Canal Company, the private enterprise that had built and operated the waterway since its completion in 1869. When word reached London that the shares were for sale, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli moved before Parliament could even be consulted. Parliament was in recess. The purchase price was £4 million, a sum the Treasury did not have sitting idle. So Disraeli sent an aide to the London banking house of Lionel de Rothschild, a personal friend, and asked for the money overnight. When Rothschild's people asked what security the government could offer, the answer that came back was simple: the British government itself. The loan was approved without a signed contract, on the personal trust between two men, and Britain owned a controlling interest in the canal by the following morning. Disraeli's own opponent, William Gladstone, accused him of undermining the constitutional order of the country by spending public money without so much as informing Parliament, and the accusation was not unreasonable, though the Queen and much of the public celebrated the coup regardless. France, through thousands of private shareholders, held the majority. Britain held the working control that mattered, and in 1888 the great powers signed the Convention of Constantinople, declaring the canal a permanently neutral zone, open to the ships of every nation in war and in peace alike, a promise that would prove far easier to write down than to keep. The Khedive's finances did not recover once the canal shares were sold. Ismail kept borrowing, and by 1876 his government could no longer service its debts at all, prompting Britain and France to impose what was formally called dual control over Egyptian revenue collection, placing European officials directly inside the Egyptian treasury to guarantee bondholders were paid before anything else was funded. When Egyptian officers rose up against foreign financial control in 1882, Britain answered with an invasion fleet and stayed for the next 74 years, formal occupation growing directly out of what had begun as a debt problem. The pattern would repeat itself, with variations: across the Ottoman Empire, across Tunisia, across half the borrowing governments of the 19th century, and it would repeat itself again, in an unfamiliar disguise, in 1956. For the next 81 years after Disraeli's loan, that one overnight transaction shaped the flow of oil, trade, and imperial power between Europe and everything east of Suez. The canal was not simply a waterway, it was the shortest sea route between the oil fields of the Persian Gulf and the refineries and industries of Western Europe, cutting thousands of miles off any voyage around the southern tip of Africa. By the middle of the 20th century, roughly two-thirds of Western Europe's oil supply moved through it. Whoever controlled the canal controlled, in a very literal sense, the fuel that kept British factories running and British ships moving. So when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser stood before a crowd in Alexandria on the 26th of July 1956 and announced that the Suez Canal Company was being nationalized, he was not simply asserting Egyptian sovereignty over Egyptian territory, though he framed it exactly that way, and correctly so. He was reaching for the same lever that Disraeli had reached for 8 decades earlier. Nasser's declared purpose was to use the canal's toll revenue to finance the Aswan High Dam, a project the United States and Britain had just withdrawn their funding from days before, largely over Nasser's growing ties to the Soviet bloc, his arms purchases from Czechoslovakia the previous year, and his recognition of Communist China. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had signed off on the withdrawal personally, believing it would humble Nasser rather than provoke him. Nasser offered full compensation to shareholders at market value, calculated on the Paris Stock Exchange price of the shares. London and Paris were not interested in compensation. They wanted the canal back, and they wanted Nasser gone. What followed was arranged with a level of secrecy that would embarrass all 3 governments involved for years afterward. British and French officials, among them Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd and French Foreign Minister Christian Pineau, met with representatives of Israel, including Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and his defense chief Moshe Dayan, at a villa in Sèvres, outside Paris, in the 3rd week of October 1956. Over 3 days they worked out an arrangement that none of the 3 governments would publicly admit to for decades. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France would then present an ultimatum calling on both Egypt and Israel to withdraw from the Canal Zone, an ultimatum they knew Nasser would refuse, since accepting it would have meant surrendering his own territory to a foreign occupying force under the cover of peacekeeping. When Nasser refused, as expected, Britain and France would intervene militarily, presenting themselves as neutral peacekeepers, separating 2 warring sides and safeguarding international shipping, a role invented for the cameras rather than the battlefield. It was a script, written in advance, performed for an audience that was not supposed to know it was watching theater. British officials were so anxious about the written record that Eden reportedly ordered the British copy of the protocol destroyed, and for years London denied any prior coordination with Israel had taken place at all, a denial that only fully collapsed once surviving French and Israeli copies of the document entered the historical record. Israeli forces crossed into Sinai on the 29th of October. The Anglo-French ultimatum followed the next day. Nasser rejected it. On the 31st of October, British and French aircraft began bombing Egyptian airfields. Egyptian forces responded by scuttling dozens of ships in the canal itself, blocking it completely, and turning the very asset both sides were fighting over into a channel of sunken wrecks. Paratroopers from both nations landed at Port Said and Port Fouad on the 5th of November, and the seaborne assault followed the next morning. In military terms, it was working. Egyptian resistance in the Canal Zone was collapsing. British commanders believed full control could be secured within another day, perhaps two, but President Dwight Eisenhower, watching from Washington, was furious in a way that went beyond ordinary diplomatic irritation. He had not been told. Britain, France, and Israel had planned and launched a war against a sovereign state without informing their closest ally, in the same week that the United States was condemning the Soviet Union for crushing an uprising in Hungary with tanks. The optics were catastrophic for American foreign policy. Washington had spent a decade positioning itself as the anti-colonial alternative to the old European empires, courting newly independent nations across Asia and Africa and the Middle East, with the argument that America was different from Britain and France, that it did not believe in gunboats and garrisons stationed on other people's soil. Now, two of its most important allies were proving the Soviet propagandists right in real time, and doing it during a week when the world's attention was already fixed on tanks rolling through the streets of Budapest. There was also a colder strategic calculation beneath the anger. Eisenhower feared that a prolonged Suez War would give the Soviet Union an opening to position itself as the defender of Arab nationalism, exactly the kind of foothold in the Middle East that Washington had spent years trying to prevent Moscow from gaining, and Moscow was already threatening, in blunt diplomatic notes to London and Paris, unspecified consequences if the fighting continued. And there was a domestic factor that rarely makes it into the popular telling of this story. The 6th of November 1956, the same day the ceasefire finally took effect, was Election Day in the United States. Eisenhower was seeking re-election, and a war his own allies had launched without warning him was not a story he wanted dominating headlines on the day Americans went to the polls. But anger alone does not stop a war. What stopped Britain was money, and the mechanism by which that happened is where the standard telling of Suez tends to go quiet, in part because the men who lived through it never fully agreed among themselves on exactly what was said or when. What is not in dispute is the arithmetic. Britain's gold and dollar reserves stood at roughly $2.3 billion in the summer of 1956, already a thin cushion for a currency that anchored the entire sterling area, a trading and monetary bloc spanning much of the former empire and Commonwealth, in which nations from Australia to Kuwait held their own reserves in pounds rather than gold or dollars. Confidence in the pound had already been fragile before a single shot was fired at Suez, weakened by concerns over Britain's balance of payments and its ability to keep financing its overseas commitments. The moment British bombers struck Egyptian airfields, that fragile confidence broke. Holders of sterling across the sterling area and beyond began converting their pounds into dollars, fearing devaluation, fearing that Britain's overstretched military adventure would end in a currency collapse, and in doing so, they helped bring about the very outcome they feared. The reserve losses in the first week of November alone ran into the tens of millions of dollars, and by the Treasury's own reckoning, the total drain for the month approached $300 million, an amount that, against a base of roughly $2 billion, was existential. The United States, separately, held close to $3.75 billion in British debt from the Anglo-American Loan Agreement signed at the end of the Second World War, a fact that gave Washington real power over London, power that had nothing to do with troop numbers or aircraft carriers. Chancellor Macmillan needed help, and the most obvious source was the International Monetary Fund, the institution born at Bretton Woods 12 years earlier specifically to backstop currencies under exactly this kind of speculative pressure. Macmillan had in fact met privately with Treasury Secretary Humphrey, Secretary of State Dulles, and President Eisenhower himself back in September at the fund's annual meetings in Washington, and had come away believing he had at least an informal assurance of American cooperation if Sterling came under pressure. But formal approval, and the political mood in which any such request would be received, mattered enormously, since the United States held the largest voting share in the fund, and Humphrey remained deeply skeptical of a large-scale intervention on Britain's behalf, while British troops were still occupying Egyptian territory. One piece of this exchange survives in writing, and it is worth pausing on precisely because so much of what follows does not. In a telegram sent to Humphrey on the 22nd of November, Macmillan acknowledged that the Americans had been following the weekly reserve figures with growing alarm since Nasser first seized the canal, and that the outflow had worsened considerably since British forces intervened in Egypt. He was, in effect, putting the crisis in writing to the one man who could authorize its resolution, careful and formal, where the later exchanges would be remembered only second-hand, if they were ever written down at all. This is the point in the record where the accounts genuinely diverge, and rather than paper over that, it is worth naming the gap directly. Macmillan later wrote in his memoirs that he telephoned New York, presumably the Federal Reserve Bank, seeking assurance of support, and was redirected to Washington, presumably the Treasury, which sent back a response making clear that no help was coming without a ceasefire. Eden, in his own memoirs, described a different version, a call from Humphrey to Rab Butler, the leader of the House of Commons, in which Humphrey stated plainly that the United States would not extend support until Britain issued a definite statement of withdrawal. Neither man specified an exact date for the call he described, and when the historian J.S. Afford examined the Bank of England's own internal records decades later, he found no documentary trace of either conversation and judged the timing each man gave to be, in his own assessment, improbable. It is entirely possible that both accounts are true in substance, if not in precise detail, that the pressure was real and communicated through more than one informal channel, and that neither Eden nor Macmillan, writing years later to explain a humiliating retreat, rendered the sequence of events with perfect accuracy. What is not contested is the outcome. Whatever combination of telephone calls, cabled messages, and simple silence conveyed it, the message that reached London was unambiguous. There would be no American support for the pound, no facilitated drawing from the fund, until Britain committed to withdrawal. Inside the Bank of England, the pressure was not only arriving from abroad. Governor Cameron Cobold was delivering warnings of his own to ministers through late October and early November, telling the cabinet that reserve losses at the current pace could not continue for more than a few more weeks without forcing a formal devaluation of the pound, a warning that carried weight entirely independent of anything said or implied in Washington. By the first days of November, the domestic and the foreign pressure were pointing at exactly the same conclusion. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Eden announced a ceasefire on the 6th of November, effective at midnight. British and French forces had taken Port Said but not yet secured the length of the canal, and the order to stop fighting arrived, by the accounts of officers on the ground, with the operation still short of its final military objective. Diplomatically, the retreat had already been decided elsewhere. At the United Nations, the Canadian Foreign Minister Lester Pearson had proposed the creation of an international peacekeeping force to replace the withdrawing British, French, and Israeli troops and supervise the ceasefire, a proposal that earned Pearson the Nobel Peace Prize the following year and gave the world its first large-scale United Nations emergency force, deployed under the authority of Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld. The canal itself remained blocked by the ships Egypt had scuttled in it, choking off the very route the entire operation had been fought to secure, and Europe's oil supply took a second blow when Syrian engineers, in a show of solidarity with Egypt, sabotaged pumping stations along the pipeline that carried Iraqi crude to Mediterranean ports. Britain, having gone to war partly to protect its oil lifeline, now found that lifeline cut from two directions at once. A Middle East Emergency Committee was hurriedly formed among Western oil companies to reroute supplies from the Americas, and petrol rationing returned to British streets for the first time since the Second World War. Coupons and all, a domestic humiliation that brought the abstract language of reserves and balance of payments into every household with a car. The word Suez itself entered British political vocabulary as shorthand for a very particular kind of failure. A government reaching for military force it no longer had the financial independence to sustain, and successive British leaders would find the word invoked against them for decades afterward. In the debates over the Falklands in 1982, and again in the arguments over Iraq in 2003, whenever the question of Britain's real capacity to act alone on the world stage resurfaced. Even with the ceasefire in place, American financial support did not arrive immediately. Washington wanted proof, not promises, and through most of November the reserve drain continued, while London and Washington negotiated the precise terms of British and French withdrawal from Egyptian territory. It was not until early December, once Britain had committed unambiguously to a full pullout, that the position in Washington shifted. On the 3rd of December 1956, at a meeting with British officials in Washington, Treasury Secretary Humphrey initially repeated his familiar objections to a large drawdown from the fund, warning that the American Treasury would have to borrow the dollars itself to finance any such operation, and that too large a request might invite similar demands from other nations, undermining the fund's own operating principles. Then, according to the account of the British ambassador present at the meeting, Sir Harold Cachia, Humphrey reversed himself within the same conversation, arguing rather suddenly that Britain should draw the maximum amount available rather than a partial sum, so that the world would see beyond any doubt that sterling had the resources to withstand further speculative attack. It was a striking, almost theatrical turn from a man who had spent months withholding exactly that kind of support, and it came only after the political condition he and his government had been waiting for, a firm British commitment to leave Egypt, had finally been met in full. The numbers that followed tell their own story. Britain drew $561 million from the International Monetary Fund in December of 1956, the largest drawing any nation had made from the fund up to that point, equal to the entirety of Britain's IMF quota and roughly 4 times the size of any previous drawing by any country. A further standby arrangement worth up to $739 million was negotiated alongside it, available if the pressure on sterling continued into the new year. In February of 1957, the United States Export-Import Bank extended an additional secured credit of $500 million at 4.5% interest, to be repaid in 10 semi-annual installments. Altogether, Britain borrowed well over $1 billion to defend a currency that had, only months earlier, still stood as the second currency of the global monetary system built at Bretton Woods, the one every other nation's peg was measured against after the dollar itself. The empire that had once lent Egypt's own money back to its rulers at punishing rates, whose gunboats had backed debt collection across the Mediterranean and the Middle East for the better part of a century, was now the party standing at the lender's door, agreeing to terms it had no real power to negotiate. The episode also changed the fund itself. Bretton Woods had built the International Monetary Fund primarily to smooth ordinary trade imbalances between member nations. not to stand between a currency and a full-scale speculative run. Suez was the first time in the fund's history that it was used explicitly for that second purpose, defending a major reserve currency against a deliberate wave of selling, and the precedent it set would be reached for again and again in the decades that followed, whenever confidence in a currency broke faster than its government could respond. Anthony Eden did not survive the crisis politically. His health, already fragile after a series of botched operations on his bile duct some years earlier that had left him dependent on medication to function, deteriorated visibly through the winter of 1956, and colleagues who saw him in cabinet described a man running on stimulants and willpower alone. In December, before Parliament, he was asked directly whether he had known in advance about the Israeli attack that preceded the Anglo-French intervention, the very collusion that had been arranged at Sèvres. He told the House of Commons he had not. It was not true, and the falsehood would follow his reputation for the rest of his life, long after the more forgivable charge of having launched a badly judged war had faded into ordinary historical debate. On the 9th of January 1957, Eden resigned as Prime Minister, citing his health, a reason that was genuine but incomplete. He was succeeded by the same man who had spent November watching the reserve figures fall, Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor whose department had absorbed the full financial shock of a war his own cabinet had voted to launch. There is a particular irony in the fact that the politician who inherited the premiership was the one who had been forced to go, in effect, hat in hand to Washington for rescue, and who would spend much of his own time in office quietly rebuilding the transatlantic relationship that Suez had shattered. Traveling to Bermuda in March of 1957 for a carefully staged reconciliation summit with Eisenhower, a meeting designed as much for the cameras as for substance, to show the world that the alliance had survived its worst quarrel in a generation. France drew its own lesson from the crisis, and it was not the same lesson Britain drew. French officials were angry that Eden had accepted a ceasefire without fully consulting Paris first, leaving French troops exposed on the ground and French prestige tied to a retreat it had not chosen on its own terms. That anger fed a broader French conclusion, one that would shape the country's foreign policy for a generation, that neither Britain's friendship nor America's promises could be relied upon when it mattered most, and that France needed the capacity to act, and to defend its own currency without asking permission from Washington. Within a decade, the French government was pursuing its own independent nuclear deterrent, and within 12 years its president, Charles de Gaulle, was doing to the American dollar something close to what Washington had just done to the pound at Suez, demanding physical gold in exchange for French dollar reserves and openly challenging the privileged position the dollar had held since Bretton Woods. The two crises, one forcing Britain to its knees in 1956 and the other rattling America's own gold window a decade later, were not separate stories so much as two chapters of the same argument about which nation's currency got to write the rules for everyone else. The Suez Canal itself reopened to shipping in April of 1957, cleared of wreckage under United Nations supervision, and remained under full Egyptian control from that point forward. Nasser, far from being deposed as Britain and France had hoped, emerged from the crisis as the most celebrated figure in the Arab world, a leader who had faced down two former imperial powers and an 11th-hour Israeli invasion and kept the canal regardless. For Britain, the loss of the canal mattered far less than the loss of an illusion that had survived, mostly intact, right up until that November. Before 1956, London still operated, at least in its own self-image, as an independent great power capable of projecting force wherever its interests required it. After 1956, that illusion was no longer sustainable, because the crisis had demonstrated, in the plainest possible terms, that Britain could not sustain a military operation of any real size without American financial cooperation, and that cooperation could be withheld as easily as it could be given. Washington moved quickly to occupy the space the crisis had opened up. In January of 1957, only weeks after Eden's resignation, Eisenhower asked Congress for authority to extend economic and military aid, including the use of American armed forces if requested, to any Middle Eastern nation resisting what his administration described as communist aggression. Congress approved it that March, and the policy became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. It was, in substance, an announcement that the United States now considered the security of the Middle East its own responsibility, a role that had belonged to Britain and France for the better part of a century, and that neither could credibly claim any longer. Macmillan understood the shift better than most of his cabinet colleagues, and he spent his premiership adjusting Britain's posture to match a smaller reality. In February of 1960, in Cape Town, he delivered what became known as the Wind of Change speech, telling his audience plainly that a growth of national consciousness was moving through Africa and that Britain's colonial administrations would have to accommodate it rather than resist it. Within a decade, most of what remained of the formal empire in Africa and Asia had become independent nations, a process that had been underway before Suez, but that accelerated once the psychological confidence behind imperial power had visibly cracked in front of the world. The consequences unspooled for more than a decade, sterling remained under periodic speculative pressure through the 1960s, propped up repeatedly by international loans and defended at a fixed exchange rate that grew harder and harder to justify against Britain's actual economic weight. In November of 1967, more than a decade after Suez, the government of Harold Wilson finally devalued the pound from $2.80 to $2.40, an admission that the currency had been overvalued for years and that the reserves to defend it indefinitely simply did not exist. The following January, in 1968, facing yet another balance of payments crisis, the same government announced that British military forces would withdraw from bases east of Suez entirely by the early 1970s, formally ending the strategic posture that had defined British power in Asia and the Middle East for more than a century. The canal that Disraeli had bought on a handshake with a Rothschild banker, the canal that Britain had gone to war to reclaim in 1956, was no longer even part of the calculation. American forces and American guarantees quietly filled the vacuum Britain left behind in the Persian Gulf, a transfer of strategic responsibility that mirrored, almost exactly, the transfer of monetary leadership that had already taken place at Bretton Woods. The retreat was not primarily military, it was financial, and it had been financial since the moment the reserve figures started falling in November of 1956. The institution that had made the December rescue possible did not fade after 1956 either. The International Monetary Fund, created as a modest stabilization fund at Bretton Woods, grew over the following decades into the body that would set the terms for currency crises and sovereign debt negotiations across Latin America, Asia, and Africa, extending conditional loans that came, as Britain's had, with demands attached to the money. The institution built to prevent a repeat of the interwar currency wars became in the process one of the most powerful instruments of financial control the world had ever seen, and Britain in 1956 had the peculiar distinction of being among the first great powers to discover, from the inside, exactly what it felt like to need that institution's permission. Suez did not create American financial power. It confirmed a shift that had already begun 12 years earlier at Bretton Woods, when the dollar was installed at the center of the international monetary system, and the pound was quietly demoted to its orbit. In 1944, that demotion had been a matter of treaty language and voting shares, abstract enough that British officials could still tell themselves the two currencies were partners rather than superior and subordinate. In 1956, the abstraction collapsed into something concrete and undeniable. A telephone call, or several calls, whose exact wording no one can fully reconstruct, communicated a simple fact that no treaty clause had ever spelled out so plainly. Britain's military could win a war in a matter of days. Britain's currency could not survive a single month of American disapproval. The empire that had once dispatched bankers ahead of its armies into Constantinople, into Cairo, into the ledgers of governments it wished to control without the expense of formal conquest, now found the very same instrument turned back on itself. Somewhere in the files of the Bank of England, and in the private papers of men who each remembered the same telephone call slightly differently, that lesson survives in fragments, contested in its details but never in its outcome. The canal was retaken and then given back within the same season. The reserves that mattered more than the canal took years to fully rebuild, and the position Britain lost in that one November was never recovered at all. Macmillan himself understood this better than anyone who came after him. In his own memoirs, published more than a decade later, he wrote candidly about the reserve figures, the calls to Washington and New York, and the sense of watching a nation's independence measured out in millions of dollars per week rather than in divisions or dreadnoughts. He had inherited the premiership from a colleague broken by the crisis, and he spent the rest of his career governing a country that understood, in a way it never had before 1956, exactly whose permission its power now required. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.